Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarcle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were two incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families, and I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal, but with one another, they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father. And it was like a union of two souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. You know, the chances of these two people meeting was, it must have been a million to one, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. You know, she'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together. 2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. And the family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he'd buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find out, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. And that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham Police Station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that'll be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. On March the 5th, 1994, the world's media had descended upon the home of Fred and Rose West in Gloucester. Police had exhumed 3 bodies from their back garden: their daughter Heather, Fred's pregnant lover Shirley Robinson, and missing teenager Alison Chambers. Now detectives were moving their search inside the property and began excavating the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street.
We started the excavations in the cellar. It was a difficult place to do excavations, and we had to be very careful about recovering the bodies. And on the first day, we did find 2 sets of human remains. One turned out to be Teresa Siegenthaler, and the second remains were Shirley Hubbard.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
With Fred and Rose as victims, one of their hallmarks, as it were, was that the fingers and toes were removed. I think we can hypothesize that there may be different reasons for that. Simple cruelty would be one. But obviously, most people know that fingerprints are a very good way to identify somebody. So removing them, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before DNA technology was really recognised, would be a way to limit the chances of that person being identified.
And that was one of the big, one of our difficulties when we were doing the investigation, trying to identify the human remains, and in particular Teresa's remains, because there was no evidence she'd been anywhere near Gloucestershire. But we were able to, in liaison with the Metropolitan Police and the missing persons, to come down to a sort of a short list of people that it could be, and then through using forensic techniques we were able to be satisfied that we had identified her remains.
As the cellar excavation continued, officers escorted Fred to a field near his home at Muchmarcle. He told them if they dug there, they'd find the body of his first wife, Rena, not seen since 1971, a year after Fred and Rose had moved in together. Rena and Fred had been married for 9 years, but she was never reported missing.
So he was taken out to the fields, and he pointed out in one field, fairly close to a hedge line, where he said that he'd buried Rena Costello.
There were now 6 victims, and back in the cellar at Cromwell Street, even more bodies were being exhumed. Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, missing since 1975. And Carol Cooper, last seen walking home from the cinema in 1973. Plus 2 familiar names the police had been looking out for, Lucy Partington and buried under the family bathroom, Linda Goff.
This was a tragedy for these young women. I mean, all murders are tragic for the victims and their families, but it was the scale of this, I think, that took the media's attention. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that 2 people could abduct young women or lure them to their house and subsequently, sexually abuse them and then kill them. I mean, it is on a scale that's almost incomprehensible.
By the 8th of March 1994, less than 2 weeks after beginning their search at Cromwell Street, police had found 10 victims. Most of them had been buried 2 decades ago, when Fred and Rose were at their most prolific. Steven Grieveson was born in Sunderland on the 14th of December 1970. He grew up in a large family, and his parents were reportedly violent towards one another.
You are molded by the environment you live in. It's a fact, everybody knows this. So if you grow up with violence, you tend to be more violent than people that don't.
Grieveson appears to show some psychopathic traits in childhood. Some of his old school reports are looked at by a psychologist at his trial, and within these reports they talk of his lack of empathy, about his callousness, about his real lack of emotion towards other people. I think there are a few red flags in Steven Grieveson's childhood, but they're not necessarily red flags that say to me, this person's going to turn into a murderer. They're red flags that say this is somebody who perhaps needs some help, needs some support, later on in childhood and in their teenage years.
Growing up, Grieveson was often in trouble, and in 1982, he was arrested for shoplifting.
He opened a packet of nails inside a shop. He didn't take the whole pack. He took 1 nail, and he got caught. And obviously the owner of the shop didn't like that very much, and he actually went to court for stealing 1 nail. 1 nail, not a pack of nails, 1 nail. But he was only 11 years old.
Extraordinarily, he was taken in front of the magistrate. Now, for most 11-year-old boys, that would be the most terrifying experience imaginable. And they would certainly not dream of doing it again, even though it was, in many ways, absolutely irrelevant, tiny crime, certainly not punishable by anything significant. But it's interesting that Grieveson didn't take that experience as any kind of lesson. He simply brushed it off, water off a duck's back. He simply went on and did what he wanted to do.
At the age of 13, social services made the decision to remove Grieveson from the family home.
Well, when he was an adolescent, he was taken into the residential care system, and he ends up at a children's home in Carlisle.
Grieveson's troubles continued through his adolescence. In May of the same year, 1990, Sunderland was rocked by the murder of a 14-year-old boy called Simon Martin. He'd been found semi-naked and bludgeoned to death in a derelict building after running away from home just days before.
I remember the Simon Martin murder very well. We had 5 murders in less than a week in Sunderland. And in hindsight, looking back, whether that was putting extra pressure on the police with a given murder inquiry involving 40, 50 police officers, a hell of a lot of police resources, and whether that would have put strain on the Simon Martin murder at the time.
The police initially thought they had quickly solved the crime after arresting a local teenager.
He was 16, he lived nearby. He was a respectable lad from a good family from memory, and he'd been playing in that building with others, and they found his fingerprints in the building.
There was blood in the building as well, and they found his fingerprint in blood, which was just coincidence.
All charges against the 16-year-old boy were eventually dropped. The murder of Simon Martin would remain unsolved for 23 years. But during the original investigation in May 1990, police had also spoken to a local 19-year-old man named Steven Grieveson.
He's somebody who had a reputation in the local area for hanging around with people younger than him. And I think when you've got somebody who's trying to get a sense of control, get a sense of power, you often feel that they hang around with people who they see as slightly inferior to them.
Grieveson was questioned by the police in the wake of Simon Martin's body being discovered. And Grieveson said, yes, I saw him, but he was fine when I left him.
Grieveson was released without charge. 3 years later, the discovery of the body of 18-year-old Thomas Kelly would trigger a series of similar deaths that would spread fear across the whole of Sunderland. By the winter of 1993, 22-year-old Steven Grieveson had built up a reputation as a troublemaker. In November of the same year, Thomas Kelly, an 18-year-old student, had gone missing from the family home he shared with his parents and his sister, Lindsay.
My brother Thomas was just a normal boy for the time, just kind, helpful. He would do anything for anybody. Loved life. We wouldn't go to bed on a night time without saying we loved each other. He used to call me Pins instead of Lins, which was a bit strange, but that was the way we went on. We argued quite a bit, as brother and sister do, but never went to bed without making up. We were very close as brother and sister. We were close as a family. We didn't have loads of money or nothing like that, but we went out and done things together. Silly things like willock picking and, you know, we just a very close family, I'd say.
Lindsay vividly remembers the day her older brother disappeared.
I went to school, my mum went to work, and then Thomas had left for college. And that was the last time we'd seen him. It was actually a bit strange that morning because we were very close as brother and sister. But that morning he was standing by the fireplace in my mum's house, and as we said bye, he walked forward and grabbed my hand and squeezed my hand.
On November the 26th, 1993, the emergency services were called to a burning shed on an allotment near Monk-Wearmouth Hospital in Sunderland.
The fire attracts attention inevitably, and the body of Thomas Kelly is found. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for whoever arrived on that allotment to confront the sight of a burning body in a burning building. It is gruesome.
When I came on the news, I wasn't listening to the news, and I was sitting in the house, and I'd seen my dad cover his face. And I went, what's wrong? And he went, there's a body being found. And they say parents get a feeling. I don't know where they go feeling at that point.
Thomas's badly burnt body had seemingly destroyed any possible evidence, and senior detectives at Northumbria Police were not convinced that he had been murdered. Detective Wilson was certain that all three deaths were linked. Not only were the crime scenes extremely similar, all three boys had attended the same school, Monk-Wearmouth Comprehensive. In August 1994, Wilson asked for a second post-mortem to be carried out on all the bodies by a senior pathologist.
You don't just call a friend and say, can you re-examine the body? No, you have to get, court orders and judges and everybody involved. And this detective was relentless. He went after it and he got the court order that was needed. This is a detective that he knew that something was wrong. When you read a case and maybe it's a gut feeling or there's something there, you go, okay, this cannot be like this.
On closer inspection, all 3 teenagers appeared to have died in the same way.
So in Grieveson's case, the most important factor was that the ligature marks are then identified. We're now moving from 3 similar but apparently discrete incidents, albeit involving 3 young boys from the same school, to 3 potential homicides from the same school the same way. Now you're almost looking towards a serial killer.
I think that the fact that Steven Grieveson killed his victims via strangulation is very significant because it's one of the most personal forms of killing. You are watching the life drain out of them. He's probably feeling more in control at the time he's killing his victims than he's ever felt at any point in his life before. So I think it's a very deliberate choice of method.
I think they were groomed, encouraged, cajoled, or perhaps even threatened by Grieveson. And they paid the price with their lives.
I remember the day very well. I was on The Sun when Northumbria Police revealed that they were treating the deaths as murder. And tragic as it was, the family would have seen that as a victory, that finally something was happening.
Detectives had found fingerprints and a footprint belonging to Grieveson in the derelict house where David Hanson was murdered. They were from a burglary Grieveson had committed months before, but proved he had access to the property. And by September 1994, Wilson had retrieved some conclusive evidence. Semen found in the stomach of the 3rd victim, 15-year-old David Grief, was a DNA match for Steven Grieveson.
If you burn the outside of the body, then you can lose injuries. If you lose the skin and the soft tissues beneath it, there's going to be less and less that you can see. But it can be surprising what you can still identify, particularly if the area is protected from the fire. You can still see maybe stab wounds. You can see all sorts of things that many people who try to dispose of a body by fire think will be gone.
Grieveson was already in prison for robbery after holding up a fish and chip shop.
Steven Grieveson was a bully. He wasn't nice. He used to go around picking on lads and taking stuff off them. He picked on teenage boys, old women, anybody that was smaller than him, I think. He was a troublemaker. Someone to keep away from. When Grieveson was arrested for the murder, we weren't shocked at all, because it was what we were fighting for months. We knew it was him. We knew that those boys had done nothing wrong. We knew that someone had done that to them.
It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Kluke and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Kluke was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Klook.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community, and that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he was doing bits and pieces. People don't understand you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin was no fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelica Klook was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelica Klook, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelica was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelica Klook. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelica Klook, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day. And when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelica intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelica Kluk under the floorboards of St Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelica's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelica's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelica's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called low cards exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelica's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he had checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.